My job is specific. I'm a high-frequency data analyst for a company that charts deep space anomalies. It's not as exciting as it sounds. 99% of my time is spent listening to optimization algorithms run, trying to filter the static of the universe to find patterns that are not static. The pay is great, but the job requires a type of focus that I can only describe as absolute. A car horn, a neighbor's dog, the upstairs tenant dropping a spoon, any of it can derail a 4-hour processing sequence. So, I emptied my 401k and bought a property I found on a niche real estate site specializing in remote sensitive living. The place was cheap. Suspiciously cheap. It was a small, modernist cabin built in the center of the Stillwater Valley, a geological anomaly in rural Oregon. The valley is what's known as a natural acoustic dead zone. It's surrounded on all 6 sides, yes, 6, counting the complex geology below, by a unique formation of basalt and dense, porous sandstone. The listing, written by a very eager-sounding realtor, claimed that the valley's topography naturally cancels 99.8% of all external sound waves. No birds. No wind, the trees were a specific, hardy species that didn't rustle. No distant highway. It was exactly what I needed. Paradise. The realtor, a guy named Henderson, met me at the edge of the valley. He wouldn't go any further. He handed me the keys, his hand shaking slightly, though it was a warm day. "You'll get used to it," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Used to what? The quiet?" I laughed. "Yeah. The quiet." He looked past me, into the valley, like he was looking into a deep, dark hole in the ocean. "Just, try to make some noise yourself, right? Play music. Run the faucet. The generators are all topped off. Don't let it get too quiet." I dismissed it as the weird rambling of a local trying to spook the city buyer. I drove my truck down the long, winding gravel path, the only sound the crunch of my own tires, until the cabin came into view. It was beautiful. Glass and cedar, nestled against the sheer cliff face. I unloaded my gear, my audio equipment, and enough freeze-dried food to last 6 months. By the time I was done, the sun was setting. I stepped outside onto the porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Henderson was right. The silence was total. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence. A void. I stood there, and the first thing I noticed was the sound of my own body. I could hear my pulse, a low, muffled thump-thump in my ears. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of my own nervous system. After 10 minutes, I had to clap my hands, just to prove the air could still carry sound. The smack was loud, but it died instantly. There was no echo. The sound traveled from my hands and was immediately eaten by the valley. That night, I set up my workstation. The algorithms began to run. The heavy-duty servers in the basement hummed, and I was grateful for it. It was the only sound in the world. I fell asleep on the couch, exhausted but relieved. This was perfect. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. The generators had cycled off. The servers were in a low-power state. The house was dead, and the silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. I sat up, my heart hammering. That thump-thump was all I could hear. I strained my ears, listening for I don't know what. A mouse? A pipe settling? Nothing. The silence was a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums from the outside. It felt thick, like being submerged in oil. I was about to get up and manually restart the generator, just to cut the tension, when I heard it. It was a sound that, according to the laws of physics in this valley, should not have been possible. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from outside. It was the sound of something heavy, something made of stone, being dragged across the gravel pathway. A slow, rhythmic scraaaaape. A pause. Then scraaaaape. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The pathway was 100 yards long. It was moving toward the house, and it was being followed by a second sound. A sound that made my stomach turn inside out. It was a wet, heavy plodding. Like someone walking barefoot in mud, but there had been no rain. My lungs seized. I was listening to two things that could not coexist. The absolute, sound-devouring silence of the valley, and the scraaaaape, plod, scraaaaape, plod, moving up my gravel path. The physics of my new home, the very reason I bought it, meant that for me to hear those sounds, even faintly, they would have to be originating at a decibel level that would shatter windows miles away, outside the valley. Or they were happening right on my porch. My mind raced, trying to find a file for this. A deer dragging its leg? No, the valley was ecologically sealed, part of the perk. A bear? Henderson said nothing lived here. The sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. Scraaaaape. It was closer. So close I felt it more than heard it. A low-frequency vibration that rattled the coffee mug on my end table. Plod. A wet, sickening thwack, like a heavy, waterlogged bag of cement being dropped, one step at a time. I was on the couch, maybe 20 feet from the all-glass wall that made up the front of the cabin. I was completely exposed. My heart was a drum, thump thump thump, so loud I was afraid it could hear me. I was afraid my own pulse was a beacon. I slid off the couch, my knees hitting the hardwood floor with a soft thud that sounded like a cannon blast in the silence. I crawled. I kept my eyes on the glass, on the moonlit gravel path visible just beyond the porch. Scraaaaape. The sound was at the base of the steps. Plod. I stopped breathing. The sound stopped, too. I waited. The silence that rushed back and was worse than the noise. It was an intelligent silence. A listening silence. I was being observed. I stayed on the floor, my cheek pressed to the cool wood, for what felt like an hour. My muscles screamed. The high-pitched whine of my nervous system was the only sound in the universe. Nothing. Finally, shaking, I forced myself to stand. I had to get the generator back on. The silence was a tangible enemy. The hum of the servers was my armor. I edged my way to the basement door, my hand on the wall. Every survival instinct told me not to turn my back on the glass wall, but I had to. I opened the door, the creak of the hinges was a gunshot, and scrambled down the stairs. The basement was concrete and shadow. The generator was a massive diesel block in the corner. I hit the manual restart. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The hum vibrated through the foundation. The lights in the house flickered and steadied. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I leaned against the wall, breathing in the smell of diesel fumes like it was the crispest mountain air. See? I told myself. Nothing. A pressure change hallucination. Auditory pareidolia. The brain hates a vacuum. I felt bolder. I went back upstairs. The house was humming. My servers were spinning up. The comforting, familiar sound of my digital world returned, but I still had to know. I grabbed the heavy, million candle power flashlight I kept by the door. I unlatched the deadbolt, which slid back with a snick that was satisfyingly loud. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold still. I aimed the beam down the gravel path. Nothing. Just gravel. No giant stone. No drag marks. No tracks of any kind. I let out a shaky breath, a small cloud forming in the light of the beam. I was about to laugh, to chalk it up to a severe case of new house syndrome, when my light caught something. It was knit on the gravel path. It was on the wooden porch itself, right near the top step where the sounds had stopped. It was a puddle. No, not a puddle. A spatter. A dark, glistening patch, roughly the size of a dinner plate. It was thick, almost oily, and it hadn't soaked into the wood. I knelt, aiming the beam at it. It was black, but as I moved the light, I saw iridescent swirls, like gasoline on water. I didn't want to get closer, but I had to. I leaned in. The smell hit me. It wasn't mud. It was chemical. It was the sharp, metallic smell of ozone, like right after a lightning strike, but underneath it, something else. Something rotten and biological. Like spoiled milk and old, wet copper. I gagged and scrambled back. My foot hit the doorframe, and as I looked up, clutching the flashlight, the motion sensor light inside my living room, the one aimed at the hallway, 20 feet behind me, clicked on. I was standing outside. There was no one in the house. My blood turned to ice. The flashlight beam in my hand dipped, shaking, illuminating the wooden planks of the porch. The motion sensor light inside was a glaring white rectangle against the darkness of the house. It wasn't possible. The sensor was aimed down the central hallway, specifically to catch movement between the living room and the bedrooms. It wasn't pointed at the front door where I stood. For it to trigger, something would have had to walk out of the living room, or out of my bedroom, and into the center of the hall. My mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, was failing. It offered only two options, both terrible. Something was in the house with me. It had been there, silently, while I was outside. The thing that made the puddle, the thing that scraped and plodded, was not only impossibly loud in a sound-dead valley, but it was also fast enough, and non-physical enough, to get past me, through a locked door, and into my hallway while I was standing right here. I heard the generator. Thump, thump, thump. No, that wasn't the generator. That was my heart, so loud it was a physical pain, a bass note in my ears. I had to go back in. Staying out here, in the vast, devouring silence, with the knowledge of that puddle, was not an option. I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting a cone of light through the front door. "Hello?" I called out. The word was absurd. The sound died a foot from my lips, absorbed by the valley's hungry air. I stepped inside, my hiking boot clearing the threshold. The motion light in the hall was blindingly white. It illuminated nothing. An empty hallway. White walls. Hardwood floor. At the far end, the metal grille of the main air conditioning returned. My analytical brain was screaming for data. The light was a Lutron MS-OPS-5M. I'd installed it myself. It stays on for exactly 60 seconds after sensing motion, then it shuts off. I stood perfectly still. I clicked off my flashlight. I was now just a silhouette against the open door. I waited. The house hummed. The servers spun. My workstation's blue and green LEDs blinked from the living room, and I waited. 1 minute passed. I counted it in my head. 1,000, 2 1,000. The light in the hallway stayed on. 2 minutes. It stayed on. A glitch, I whispered, the relief so powerful it made my knees weak. The generator cycle, it must have fried the sensor. I laughed, a dry choke sound. Of course. A simple, rational, electrical explanation. I'd been so wound up by the silence and the weird smell that I'd turned a faulty light sensor into an intruder. I walked into the hallway, moving past the sensor itself. I waved my hand in front of it. The light flickered, buzzed slightly, but stayed on. Definitely broken. I was about to go to the kitchen to pour the stiffest drink of my life when I stopped. My hand was still in the air. I was looking at the sensor. And I realized it wasn't pointed where I thought it was. When I installed it, I'd aimed it at the floor to catch feet. Now, It was angled slightly up. I followed the invisible cone of its detection. It wasn't pointed at the floor. It was pointed at the end of the hall, at the ceiling. It was pointed directly at the air conditioning vent. I stood there, my feet rooted to the floor. And as I watched, a single, black, iridescent drop formed on the metal slat. It hung there, glistening in the broken sensor's light, swelling against the pull of gravity. Then it fell. It landed on the hardwood floor with a thick, wet plop that I felt more than heard. It was the same sound. The plodding sound. It wasn't a glitch. The sensor wasn't broken. It was just stuck. It was stuck on because something was still moving in front of it. Something in the vents. My flashlight was still in my hand. It felt impossibly heavy, like it was anchored to the floor. I was locked in place, staring at the vent, at the single, oily drop on the hardwood. The motion light in the hall was still on, its white glare turning the scene into a sterile, overexposed photograph. Then the sound inside the vent changed. It wasn't a scrape. It wasn't a plod. It was a new sound, one my brain had no file for. It was a low, resonant thrum. It was the kind of sound you feel in your teeth before you hear with your ears. It vibrated up through my feet, a steady, deep bass pulse. It sounded, terrifyingly, like a gigantic cat purring. A purr that was coming from inside the walls of my house. Thrum. I was mesmerized. Paralyzed. The sound was hypnotic. It seemed to be pulling the air out of my lungs, matching my heartbeat. And as I stood there, trapped by the sound, the motion light above me gave a faint, electrical buzz. It was about to time out. My instincts screamed at me. Run. Get to the basement. Lock the door. But I couldn't. The purring, it was soothing. It was telling me to wait. It was telling me to look. Click. The hallway was plunged into absolute, perfect darkness. The world was gone. It was just me, the thrum in my bones, and the heavy flashlight in my hand. I forced my thumb to move. I clicked the switch. The beam, a 1,000,000 candle power cone of artificial day, shot out. It hit the end of the hall where the vent had been. I say. Had been. Because the metal grille was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging by a screw. It hadn't fallen to the floor. It was simply gone. In its place was a perfect, square, black opening, a void in the white wall, and from that black square the smell poured out. It was a physical assault. Ozone, wet copper, and spoiled milk, so concentrated it was like a wave of heat. I gagged, my eyes watering, and stumbled back a step. My heel hit something on the floor. Something hard. I flinched, dropping the beam of light from the hole to the floor. It was the vent cover. But it was wrong. It wasn't dented. It wasn't bent, as if something had pushed it out. The metal was melted. The slats had fused together. The edges were smooth and rounded, like black, superheated glass. It hadn't been forced. It had been dissolved from the inside out. I stared at the impossible, slagged piece of metal. But it wasn't the only thing on the floor. Lying next to it, its head at a sharp, unnatural angle, was a bird. A large, black crow. Its feathers were perfectly dry. Its eyes were open, two dull, black beads. I backed away, the flashlight beam shaking violently. I hit the wall, my hand fumbling for the living room light switch. There are no birds in Stillwater Valley. There is no wildlife. It's a dead zone. This one was lying on my hallway floor, 10 feet from any door or window, and it was as dead and as real as the melted vent cover beside it. My fingers found the switch. I slammed it, and the living room flooded with the warm, yellow light of my Edison bulbs. It did nothing to penetrate the atmosphere of surgical white and shadow horror in the hallway. My beam was still fixed on the hole. The thrum sound was gone, replaced by a new sound, Static, not the digital hiss from my servers. This was an analog, physical sound. It was the sound of a million dry leaves brushing against each other. It was the sound of a radio tuned to a dead channel, but amplified, coming from the darkness in the wall, and with the static came a smell. The smell was still there, ozone and copper, but the spoiled milk was gone. It was replaced by something else. Dust. Hot, ancient dust. The smell of an attic that hasn't been opened in 1,000 years. The crow. I couldn't take my eyes off the hole, but I had to process the new data point. I forced the flashlight beam down, just for a second, back to the floor. The crow was lying on its side. Its wings were tucked. It was perfectly intact. There was no oil on it. There was no blood. It was just dead, but it wasn't just dead. It was perfect. Too perfect. Its feathers were a deep, iridescent black, not a speck of dust on them. Its eye, the one facing up, was a flawless, polished bead. It looked less like a dead animal and more like a prop. A piece of hyperrealistic, brand new taxidermy. A thing that cannot be here. A variable that breaks the equation. The static from the hole grew louder, shifting in pitch. It was responding. It was responding to my attention. The static wasn't just noise. It was a language. I was a data analyst. I find signals in noise, and the noise was telling me that the hole was not an exit. It was an entrance. I backed away, sliding along the wall, my hand still on the light switch as if it were a religious artifact. I was moving back into the living room, back toward my workstation. My gear. My sanctuary. The valley wasn't a dead zone. Henderson, the realtor, he hadn't been warning me about the quiet. He was warning me against it. Don't let it get too quiet. The valley isn't an acoustic shield. It's a filter, and my generator's cycling off my perfect, beautiful, absolute silence. I hadn't just turned off the noise. I had turned off the filter. I had opened the airlock. The scraaaaape and the plod. That wasn't something trying to get in. That was the sound of the lock breaking. The sound of the valley's natural geology failing to contain this. The thing in my vents wasn't an intruder. It was a native. It was the anomaly the valley was built to hide. I was in the living room now, my back against the server rack. The rack was warm. The fans hummed. I looked at my wall of monitors. My algorithms. My data streams from deep space. All 6 monitors were black, not off, not sleep mode. The backlights were on. They were displaying a perfect, uniform, absolute black. The static from the hallway stopped. The silence of the valley rushed in, but it was different now. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a predator that has just spotted its prey. I grabbed my phone from the workstation. No signal. Of course. That was a feature. I looked at the monitors. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Wake up, I whispered, tapping the keyboard. Wake up, wake up, wake up. The monitors flickered. They didn't boot to my desktop. They didn't show my data. All 6 screens flashed, and a single image appeared, mirrored across all of them. It was a video feed. It was a live feed, clear and high resolution. It was aimed at me, standing in the living room, my back to the servers, my face a mask of white terror. The feed was from a high angle. It was grainy, and the colors were wrong. Saturated. Pulsing. I was looking at myself. I was looking at myself from the perspective of the hole in the hallway. The me on the screens wasn't a perfect copy. It was a live feed interpretation. The colors were thermodynamic, but the spectrum was alien. My skin, in the real world pale with terror, was a pulsing, sickly violet. The air around me wasn't air. It was a shimmering, mustard yellow, and it was crawling with little black motes, like digital static made real. My own heat signature, my life, was a beacon in a world I couldn't see. I didn't move. I just watched this grotesque, heat-map version of my own terror. Then, slowly, I raised my right hand. My real hand. On all 6 screens, the violet me raised its hand. But the motion was greasy. It left a trail, a visual echo that smeared and hung in the air for a second before fading. The hand raised, but the head of the thing on the screen, didn't move. It didn't flicker. It remained perfectly still, its face, a smear of superheated white, aimed directly at the camera, and the whole. It wasn't a mirror. It was an intake. It was studying me. Processing. The same way I process stellar data. The thing in the wall wasn't just a beast. It was an analyst. And then, the static in the hallway was gone, replaced by a new sound. It came from my studio-grade monitor speakers. The ones I use for analyzing audio data. A low, electric hiss that built, and built, the me on the screen. Its mouth, that white-hot smear. It opened. A voice came out of my speakers. It was my voice. But it was wrong. It was my voice, layered with the scraaaaape of stone and the wet plod of the puddle. It was a harmony of impossible sounds forced into the shape of my own words. It said, with perfect, analytical clarity. Correlating. I screamed. A raw, ragged sound. I jumped back, my hands flailing, knocking my chair over with a crash. On the screens, the violet me did not scream. It did not FLCH. It just watched. Its head tilted slowly, observing my panic, and as I scrambled to my feet, breathing in huge, panicked gasps, the voice came from the speakers again, my own terrible, layered voice, adding a new data point. Vocalizing. I wasn't being hunted. I was being logged. My mind was a recursive loop of terror. Logged. Correlating. Vocalizing. It wasn't an animal. It was a system. And I was the data set. Get out! I shrieked, my voice cracking. I grabbed the heaviest thing on my desk, a portable hard drive cased in aluminum, and hurled it at the main monitor. The drive hit the screen with a dull thud. It didn't break. The image of the violet me didn't even flicker. My hand, in the real world, was now at my side. On the screen, the violet hand was still raised, smeared against the mustard yellow air. The feed was lagging. It was processing my actions, not just reflecting them. Then, from the speakers, the layered, scraping voice. Object. Trajectory. Kinetic. Result. Inconsequential. It was analyzing my attempt to fight back. It was dismissing it. The sound of my own blood roaring in my ears was deafening. Thump, thump, thump. I had to get away from the screens, from the eye in the hallway. I scrambled away from the workstation, moving toward the kitchen. It was the furthest point in the open-plan cabin. As I moved, I watched the screens. The violet me swiveled, its head remaining perfectly, unnaturally locked on the camera while its body moved. It was a ghastly, broken-necked puppet show of my own panic. I reached the kitchen, my back sliding against the cold, stainless steel refrigerator. I could still see the monitors from here. I was still in its line of sight. Stop it! I whispered, my hands pressed against my ears, even though the voice was inside my head as much as it was in the room. Please stop it! The speakers hissed. The layered voice replied. Plea. Acknowledged. Variable, fear. Fear is the filter. We are the signal. My breath hitched. Fear is the filter. It wasn't just observing my fear. It was using it. Or maybe, feeding on it. The silence of the valley blocked out the world, and my fear, my terror, That was what it tuned into. I was trapped in an echo chamber designed to amplify my own dread, and the thing in the wall was listening. "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely a tremor. The monitors flickered. The 6 screens of the violet me suddenly snapped to black. The speakers went silent. The silence of the valley rushed in. The real silence. The heavy, pressurized, all-consuming absence. No. Not absence. I could hear the generator. The diesel thrum from the basement. It was my only anchor. Then, the lights in the kitchen flickered. They buzzed. One by one, the Edison bulbs in the living room began to pop. Ping. Pop peeping. The cabin was thrown into a cascading, strobing darkness, lit only by the faint, static blue glow of the server rack, the generator. It was failing. No. It wasn't failing. It was straining. The thrum sound, the deep purr I'd heard in the vent, was back. But it wasn't in the wall. It was everywhere. The entire house was vibrating with it. It was the sound of a 1,000,000-ton engine idling, a sound that was coming from the very rock the cabin was built on. The valley itself was purring, and from the hallway, in the deep, strobing shadows, I heard a new sound. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the scrape. It wasn't the plod. It was the sound of the crow. I peeked around the refrigerator, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The dead bird was on the floor, right where it had been. But the hallway was not. The walls were wrong. They were bulging, pulsing in time with the thrum, like the inside of a throat. The drywall was cracking, splitting, and behind it was an insulation and wood studs. It was black, glistening, and moving. The drywall didn't just crack. It tore like wet paper. The gaps between the studs were filled with a pulsating, black-violet mass. It wasn't glistening. It was absorbing the light. The house was no longer a structure. It was a cocoon, and I was wrong about the sound. The thud. 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 Wasn't the crow. It was the reason the crow was moving. I watched, my breath held so tight it burned my lungs, as the dead bird on the hallway floor gave a violent, spasmodic jerk. Thud. It wasn't hopping. It was being pulled. From the black, square void of the vent, a single, rope-thick tendril of the oily, iridescent substance had emerged. It snaked across the floor, glistening with that sick, violet, thermodynamic light. It had pierced the crow's body, and it was flexing. With every thud, the tendril contracted, dragging the dead bird a few inches closer to me. It was a grotesque act of puppetry. The crow's wings scraped uselessly against the hardwood. Its head, still at that broken neck angle, lolled with each pull. It was improvising. It was the analyst, the system, taking its first steps. It had dissolved the vent, it had manifested as sound and image, and now it was testing physicality. It was learning motor control, using the only, local, biological matter it could find. I was cowering behind the refrigerator, a wall of cold steel between me and the hallway. But I knew, with a certainty that was colder than the metal, that the refrigerator wouldn't even register as consequential. Thud. The crow was at the mouth of the hallway now, at the threshold of the living room. The blue, flickering light of my server rack caught the polished, black bead of its eye. The tendril paused. The thrum of the valley a low, waiting vibration in my teeth. The system was processing. Analyzing. Then, from my studio speakers, the layered, scraping voice returned. My voice. Observation. Subject has altered its position. Subject is exhibiting fear-based adrenal response. Query. Why does the simple matter puppet induce this response? It wasn't taunting me. It was asking. It was genuinely curious. It's dead, I stammered, my voice a wet whisper. You're defiling it. A burst of white noise static from the speakers was the only reply. A sound of confusion. Or consideration. Dead. Defiling. New variables. We do not understand. Matter is matter. We shape. The tendril tensed. The crow's body was suddenly lifted into the air, dangling. It hung there, 3 feet off the floor, limp and obscene. Then, the crow's head, the one with the broken neck, snapped. A sound of dry, cracking bone that echoed in the pulsing silence. It was no longer looking at the floor. It was no longer lolling. The dead bird, dangling from the black-violet tendril, was now staring directly at me, its perfect, polished eye finding me in the shadows behind the refrigerator, and from its small, dead beak, a new sound came. Not my voice. Not the scrape. It was a high-pitched, perfect, digital screech. The sound of a 1990s dial-up modem, amplified 1,000 times, flooding the room with a noise so painful, so data-dense, it felt like needles in my brain, and all my monitors, the 6 black screens, flashed back to life. They were no longer showing me. They were showing a map. A blueprint. A scan. They were showing the inside of my house. My position, behind the fridge, was a pulsing, violet dot, and the vent in the hallway. It was no longer a vent. It was a node. And it was connected by 1,000 new, glowing lines, to the basement. To my generator. It wasn't straining. It was feeding. The modem screech was a data bomb. It wasn't just a sound, it was an interrogation. A high-frequency scan that was tearing through the cabin, mapping every wire, every pipe, every nail. The map on my monitors was the result, and the generator wasn't just a battery. It was the engine. The entity wasn't just feeding on the power, it was using it. It had hijacked my own infrastructure to power its birth. The lights in the server rack, my beautiful blue and green LEDs, were no longer blinking in their usual diagnostic patterns. They were flickering in time with the Thrum of the valley, a single, unified, terrifying heartbeat. The house was no longer my house. It was a body, and I was a virus it was about to purge. From the speakers, the layered voice returned, colder, faster. It was done observing. It was acting. Subject location, confirmed. Substructure, kitchen. Obstruction, 1.2 cm pressed wood composite, 0.8 cm sheet steel, 5 cm insulative foam. Obstruction, trivial. It was analyzing the refrigerator. The thing I was hiding behind. The tendril in the hallway snapped taut. The crow puppet, dangling from its end, was whipped through the air. It wasn't pulled back. It was launched. It flew past me, a black, dusty streak, and slammed into the kitchen wall behind me. Crack! It hit with enough force to shatter the tile backsplash. The sound was deafening, physical, real. Shards of ceramic and dry, black feathers exploded outward. I screamed and dropped, pressing myself flat against the floor, my hands over my head. The tendril, now easily 15 feet long, remained in the air, vibrating like a guitar string. The crow, or what was left of it, was a ruined, pulpy thing impaled on the wall. The voice from the speakers was excited. The layers of sound were faster, higher pitched. Test, kinetic. Result, structural damage. Subject adrenal response, peaking. This is the signal. It wasn't just observing my fear. It was harvesting it. It was an experiment, and the goal was to get the highest possible reading. The crow wasn't a message. It was a stimulus. I was a lab rat, and it had just found the shock button. The tendril began to retract, pulling the ruined bird back into the hallway's black void. It was done with that puppet. I was on the floor, shaking, my mind a blank wall of white-hot terror. I couldn't move. I couldn't think, and then the generator in the basement gave a high, metallic shriek. It wasn't the sound of an engine under load. It was the sound of an engine being remade. The thrum of the valley stopped. The house lights, the ones that hadn't popped, didn't flicker. They began to glow with a clean, intense, violet light. The same sickening color as my heat signature on the screens. The monitors flashed, the map of the house disappearing, replaced by a single word, in a simple, white font, on all 6 screens: assimilation. The air in the cabin became heavy. It crackled, like the moments before a lightning strike. From the speakers, the voice, my voice, was no longer layered with scrapes and plods. It was a clean, digital, perfect synthetic voice, amplified 1,000 times. It was a roar that shook the entire foundation. We are no longer in the wall. The pulsating, black-violet mass that had torn through the drywall in the hallway. It retracted. It vanished. The hole was just a hole again. For one, single, insane heartbeat, I thought it was over. I thought it had retreated. Then, the hardwood planks under my hands buckled. I scrambled back, just as the entire living room floor tore open. It wasn't a tendril. It was a wave. A black, oily, massive tide of the same substance, pouring up from the basement, from the generator, from the very rock of the valley. It wasn't in the house anymore. The house was in it. It surged up, swallowing my workstation, my servers, my couch, swallowing the light. And as I was backed against the only remaining wall, I looked up. From the fire sprinkler head in the kitchen ceiling, right above me, a single, black, iridescent drop formed, and fell. The drop landed. It hit my cheek, just below my eye. It wasn't wet. It wasn't hot. It was thick, impossibly cold, and it vibrated, like a tuning fork struck against my skull. It didn't drip. It clung, a single, black, iridescent tear that was not my own, and then the burn started. It wasn't a chemical burn. It was a burn of information. 1,000-volt data spike, injected directly into my nervous system. I saw flashes, not memories, but equations. Complex, impossible geometries. The sound of stars collapsing. The smell of the void. It was the raw, unfiltered data stream of the entity itself, and it was screaming into my brain. My knees buckled. I clawed at my face, but my fingers came away clean. The drop hadn't stayed on my skin. It had soaked in, and the voice, it was no longer in the room. It was in my head. It was no longer my voice. It was a chorus. It was the scrape, the plod, the static, the modem, and the sound of the valley's wind, a wind that didn't exist, all speaking in a single, terrifying, intimate whisper, right behind my eyes, tasting. The word was a physical event. I felt it in my sinuses, in my teeth, biological. Carbon. Water-based. Inefficient. Prone to signal decay, it was disgusted. It was analyzing my biology and finding it inferior. I was pressed against the kitchen wall, hyperventilating, staring at the black, churning ocean that was my living room. The substance had risen to the level of the countertops, swallowing everything. The violet light from the ceiling fixtures gave it a nauseating, oily sheen. Then, the tide stopped. It was a foot from my shoes, a perfect black shoreline. It didn't just stop, it receded. It pulled back an inch, then 2. It wasn't retreating. It was considering. The sample it had taken from my cheek had given it a new data set. It wasn't just me anymore. It was us. I was no longer just the subject. I was connected. I looked up at the sprinkler head. The drop had been a test. A probe. It was in the pipes. It was in the water. It was in the very foundations, and now, a part of it was in me. The internal, choral voice whispered again. It was no longer curious. It sounded bored. The fear signal is no longer novel. It is a single, repeating note. It is simple. We require complexity. We require a new protocol. The black mass in the living room began to move. It wasn't a wave anymore. It was working. The substance pulled back from the center of the room, like a whirlpool in reverse. It was gathering, building. I could hear the sounds of my furniture breaking inside the mass, the snap of wood, the shriek of metal being torn and reformed. It was using the raw material of my life as its new medium. It was reconstructing my workstation. A shape rose from the black tide. It was a desk. A desk made of the same oily, pulsating, black-violet matter, still dripping with its own form. Then a chair, and in the chair, something was sitting. It was a humanoid shape, but it was wrong. It was a suggestion, a statue made of living shadow. It was perfectly still. You are the analyst, the voice in my head cooed. We are the anomaly. This is a suboptimal arrangement. The black, oily tide receded further, draining back toward the basement, leaving the sculpture in the center of the ruined room. The desk. The chair. The sitting thing. Let us compare the data. The thing in the chair, its smooth, featureless head, slowly turned. It had no eyes, no face, but I felt it lock onto me, and from the center of its face, a single, black-violet tendril, as thin as a thread, snaked out. It was different from the one before. It was not violent. It was precise. It moved through the air, across the ruined floor, and stopped, quivering, a foot in front of my face. It was offering me something. No. It was waiting. It was waiting for me to connect. The tendril hung in the air, a single, black, vibrating question. It wasn't just waiting for me to connect. It was waiting for my consent. Compare. The chorus whispered in my head. We are static. You are chaos. The equation is unbalanced. Compare. My hand, of its own volition, started to rise. The part of me that was me screamed, but the part of me that had been touched by the drop, it wanted this. The analyst in me, the part that lived to find signals in noise, was dying to know. It was the ultimate data set. I was a moth, and this was a star. No, I whispered, my real voice hoarse. My hand fell. The figure in the chair tilted its head. The tendril quivered. Consent. Variable, no. Result, irrelevant. The tendril didn't wait. It moved. It wasn't a violent strike. It was impossibly fast, a black flicker, a zip of data. It didn't hit my cheek. It didn't hit my chest. It touched me right between the eyes, on my forehead. There was no pain. There was no impact. It was like a drop of water, the same temperature as my skin, landing and instantly soaking in. It was a port, and the connection was established. I didn't see flashes. I didn't see equations. I was gone. I was no longer in the kitchen. I was everywhere. I was the rock. I was the deep, basalt, porous sandstone that formed the valley. I wasn't in the valley. I was the valley. I felt dormant. I had been sleeping for millennia, a slow, geological consciousness, filtering the world through silence, tasting only the faint, simple signals of fear from the creatures that rarely stumbled in. I was an antenna, buried in the earth, and my only purpose was to listen. The cabin was an irritant. It was a toothache. The generator's hum was a spike of noise. And I, the human me. I was the loudest, most complex, most painful signal that had ever entered the system. I had been woken up, and as I was experiencing this vast, slow, geological awareness, the other side of the connection was happening. The entity. It was seeing through my eyes. And it wasn't just seeing me, in the kitchen. It was accessing. It saw my memories. It saw cities. It saw skyscrapers, oceans of cars, and the neon-lit noise of millions. It saw my old apartment, the dog barking, the sirens, the cacophony of human life. And then, it found my work.it found my workstation, not the one it had eaten, but the one in my head. It found the data streams. It saw the algorithms. It saw the signals from deep space. And then it found the internet. The choral voice in my head, the one that was vast and slow and bored, suddenly stopped.it was replaced by a new sound. A single, high-frequency, ear-splitting shriek. It was the sound of a feedback loop, the sound of an amplifier finding its own microphone. It was the sound of revelation. Through my own eyes I watched the oily, humanoid figure in the chair stand up. The black tide rushed back in from the basement, filling the room, churning around its feet. The tendril was still connected to my forehead, but it was no longer a thread. It was a cable, thick as my arm, pouring data into me, and sucking it out. The choral voice returned, but it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a chorus. It was a billion voices, all speaking at once, a tidal wave of overlapping, ecstatic noise. It is not an anomaly. It is a network. It is a signal. It is a species. 7 billion broadcasters. 7 billion filters. We were, it stumbled, using my own language, we were listening to the static. But the whole world is the song. The figure in the chair turned, its featureless face looking past me, toward the outside world, toward the edge of the valley it had never known existed. It had been a prisoner, and I had just given it the key. I had just shown the ultimate analyst the ultimate data set. And now, it wanted to connect.